On the first hot Monday of August, when dust hung low over Whitcomb Road and cicadas screamed from the cottonwoods behind the feed store, Clara Whitcomb opened the doors of her father's grain elevator for the first time since his funeral and began filling it with grain nobody else wanted. The elevator stood at the edge of Harlan Creek, Kansas, where Main Street narrowed into a county road and the old railroad spur cut through the prairie like a scar that had never healed. Its tin siding had faded silver. Its wooden legs leaned just enough to make strangers nervous. The sign across the scale house still read, "Whitcomb Grain and Feed," though half the letters had been sanded pale by 30 years of wind. By sunrise, 3 battered grain trucks were lined up outside the pit. Their beds carried wheat and corn. The big terminal 70 miles east had marked too damp, too uneven, too risky, too late. Most of those farmers had planned to dump it for whatever price the buyers offered before the railroad made its final harvest run through Harlan Creek. But Clara had offered cash. Not much cash, not enough to make anyone proud, but enough to make desperate men back their trucks onto the old scale and watch a 24-year-old woman in dusty jeans write down weight tickets with her father's pencil. The first load came down in a roar. Wheat rushed through the grate like yellow water, carrying the smell of heat, chaff, and summer fields. Dust rose around Clara's face until her eyelashes looked white. Across the road, pickups slowed. Men leaned toward their windows. The banker from Harlan County Savings watched from beside his polished truck, coffee in one hand, a foreclosure folder tucked under the other arm. Every farmer in the county knew the elevator was finished. It had no modern contract, no corporate backing, no fresh paint, no crew, no safety net. Its bins had stood empty for almost 2 years while Clara's father got sicker and the larger grain companies pulled the county toward distant terminals. Once the final train left, the railroad spur would be discontinued. After that, the elevator would be nothing but a tall, rusting monument to a town that used to matter. And yet Clara kept buying. By sunset, the old elevator had swallowed more grain than it had held in years. Clara climbed the outside ladder in amber light, one hand gripping the rung, the other carrying a battered notebook. Below her, the townspeople watched as if she were climbing into a storm. Her father had left her 96 acres, a peeling white farmhouse, a leaning barn, 2 broken augers, a half-dead tractor, and this empty elevator beside the tracks. He had also left her a debt large enough to make every room in the house feel smaller. Martin Whitcomb had run grain through that elevator for most of his adult life. In the old days, farmers came from 15 miles around during harvest. Trucks lined the road from dawn until night. The scale bell rang. The office smelled like coffee, pencil shavings, and dry wheat. Clara remembered falling asleep under the desk as a child, while her father worked late, listening to the elevator hum through the floorboards like a living thing. Then the big buyers arrived with faster legs, bigger bins, and lower handling fees for farmers who could haul long distances. Martin tried to keep the elevator alive. He patched belts, rebuilt motors, carried accounts longer than he should have, and gave farmers time when the bank would not. But sickness narrowed his world. By the time Clara came home for good, the office windows were cloudy with dust, the bins were empty, and the bank had started calling every Friday. She was too young, people said, too quiet, too stubborn. She had studied soil science for 2 years at community college before her father got sick, but that did not mean she could run a farm, let alone an elevator. Around Harlan Creek, knowledge only counted if it had calluses on both hands and 20 hard harvests behind it. The banker had offered a clean way out. Sell the farm before foreclosure. Sell the elevator before it became a liability. Take the land investor's offer while there was still an offer to take. Everyone told themselves it was kindness when they repeated the same advice in the feed store, at church, beside gas pumps, and across fence lines. Clara listened. She nodded when she had to. Then she went home and repaired the scale. The first man who said it to her face was Earl Maddox. He had farmed the north section longer than Clara had been alive, and his hands looked permanently stained by diesel, soil, and old disappointment. He pulled his red pickup beside the scale house just after the 7th truck dumped into the pit. The engine kept running. The door stayed open. Earl stepped down slowly and looked up at the elevator as if it were a sick animal Clara was refusing to put down. Clara was bent over the scale desk, writing a moisture number beside a farmer's name. She heard Earl come in, heard his boots drag chaff across the wooden floor, but she did not look up until his shadow covered the paper. He asked if she was buying every bad load in the county now. Clara set the pencil down and said it was not bad grain. Earl looked through the dusty window toward the pit, where wheat still trickled down the grate in a thin golden stream. He reminded her that the terminal had rejected one of those loads the day before. Clara turned the ticket toward him. The paper showed the moisture, test weight, dockage, field name, and cutting time. Earl glanced at it, then at her, and shook his head before the numbers had a chance to mean anything. He told her that her father would have known better than to gamble on damp wheat with bank money breathing down his neck. The office went still. On the wall behind Earl hung a photograph of Martin Whitcomb in a seed cap, smiling beside a line of loaded trucks from 20 years earlier. Earl did not look at the picture. Clara did. Then she said her father did know better. Earl's face hardened. He told her the building was empty for a reason. The railroad was leaving for a reason. The little farms were hauling east for a reason. She could not bring back a whole way of life because she had found some notes in her daddy's desk. Clara reached for the next ticket. Earl waited for her to defend herself. She did not. She wrote the number, tore off the receipt, and slid it across the desk to the farmer waiting behind him. By noon, the whole town knew Earl Maddox had tried to talk sense into Martin Whitcomb's daughter and failed. That was the day the laughter changed. Before Earl, people called Clara stubborn. After Earl, they began calling her dangerous. Dangerous to herself, dangerous to the farm, dangerous to the last good memory Harlan Creek had of her father. And still, by sundown, Clara had bought another 1,200 bushels. Clara did not find the ledger because she was searching for wisdom. She found it because a mouse had died in the wall. The smell started on a Wednesday morning in the old elevator office, sharp and sour beneath the familiar dust. Clara had gone in to find receipt blanks and ended up on her knees, pulling warped drawers from the lower cabinet. The first drawer held rusted bolts, cracked moisture charts, a mouse-chewed bag of rubber bands, and a coffee can full of elevator keys. The second drawer would not move. She braced one boot against the counter and pulled until the wood screamed. The drawer came loose all at once, throwing her backward onto the floor. A dead mouse slid out with yellowed papers. Clara cursed under her breath, then froze. Behind the drawer, hidden in the hollow space between the cabinet and the wall, was a book wrapped in a seed corn sack and tied with baling twine. For a long second, she only looked at it. Then she cut the twine with her pocket knife. A brown ledger appeared, its cover darkened by oil from hands that had turned it open thousands of times. Her father's handwriting waited on the first page. Not the neat version he used on bank forms. The real version, fast, slanted, impatient. The handwriting he used when work mattered more than looking careful. At first, the entries seemed ordinary. Names, loads, moisture percentages, dockage, test weights, dates. Then a note appeared in the margin beside a wheat load from the Maddox place. North wind after rain, open top vents by 11 p.m., pull center before sunrise. Clara turned faster. A few pages later, another note sat beneath a list of discounted corn. Buyer marked wet, held 3 nights, blended with dry south bin, made grade, farmer paid back difference. The pages changed in her hands. They stopped being records and became something alive. Her father had written down which fields dried late after creek fog, which farms cut early because a banknote was due, which buyers dropped basis before a rail pickup, which bins cooled fastest when the north wind came across the flat ground beyond the cemetery. She found a hand-drawn map of the elevator's bins. Beside bin 4, her father had written that the old wooden duct pulled air more evenly than the new metal one if the fan was started after midnight. Beside bin 7, He had marked a warning about heat pockets near the south wall. On the back page, he had circled one sentence so hard, the pencil nearly tore the paper. Small farmers lose twice when they lose local storage. First when they sell too soon, again when they sell alone. Clara read that line once, then again. Outside, a truck hissed past on the wet road, hauling grain toward the big terminal east of town. It crossed the tracks without stopping. Clara carried the ledger to the window. From there, she could see the empty pit, the silent scale, the railroad spur, and the bins everyone in town had already written off as dead. But now the building looked different, not newer, not stronger, just less empty. Her father had not left her an answer. He had left her a method. The grain she bought was not rotten, it was uneven. Some loads were too damp, some were mixed from fields harvested before rain. Some had been discounted so sharply that farmers had driven away from the big terminal with their mouths tight and their hands white on the steering wheel. They lacked time, leverage, and somewhere close to hold grain until it could be dried, tested, blended, and sold as a full rail shipment. Clara had almost no money, but she had the elevator. She had her father's records. She had 21 days before the final train, and she had the kind of patience people mistook for weakness because it did not make noise. For 3 weeks, she worked inside a world of dust and metal. Before sunrise, she climbed the bins with a thermometer probe and a flashlight. She opened vents when the air turned dry. She closed them when humidity rose from the creek bottom. She ran fans until the motors grew hot, then shut them down, greased bearings, and ran them again. She separated wheat by condition, corn by moisture, and every load by the field it came from. The elevator fought her the whole way. A belt snapped and slapped the housing so hard it sounded like a gunshot. The west fan tripped a breaker every time she ran it longer than 40 minutes. One bin started heating near the center, and she had to transfer grain by hand and auger, coughing through a bandana while sweat ran down her back. The bills did not wait. The bank sent another notice. The power company called about the elevator's rising usage. Diesel cost more than she had planned. Each evening, as the elevator lights glowed against the darkening prairie, trucks rolled slower past the tracks. The diner crowd counted the days until the final harvest run. The breaking point came on the 15th night. The rain had not started yet, but the air was heavy enough to taste. Clara had been awake since 4 that morning, moving grain out of bin 7 because the temperature probe showed heat gathering near the south wall. Her shirt clung to her back. Her hands shook every time she reached for the ladder. At 9:30 that night, the west fan quit again. Not slowly. Not with warning. It died with a sharp electrical snap, and the elevator dropped into a silence so sudden Clara heard grain shifting inside the bin like sand in a coffin. She ran to the breaker box. The metal panel shocked her fingertips when she touched it. When she reset the breaker, the fan below only hummed and gave off the hot smell of burning insulation. Clara went down the stairs too fast and slipped on loose wheat near the bottom. Her knee hit the steel landing. Pain flashed white behind her eyes. For several seconds, she stayed there on all fours, breathing dust. Then the office phone rang. No one called that late unless they wanted money. She limped across the scale house and picked up. The banker's voice came through flat and careful. The bank needed updated proof of income within 10 days. The extension was not permanent. The foreclosure review was moving forward. He hoped she understood that hope was not a repayment plan. Clara did not remember hanging up. She remembered standing in the office afterward with the receiver still warm in her hand. Through the dirty window, she could see the elevator lights reflected in spilled grain. The whole place looked like a ship taking on water in the middle of a dry prairie. On the desk lay her father's ledger, open to the page about bin 7. Beside it sat the power bill, the bank notice, 3 unpaid fuel invoices, and a paper sack containing the last sandwich she had forgotten to eat. For the first time since opening the elevator, Clara said the thing everyone else had been thinking. Maybe this was dead before she touched it. The thought came quietly, which made it more dangerous. She imagined switching off the lights, locking the office, calling the banker in the morning, letting the land investor have the elevator, the farm, the tracks, the sign, the burden. Then, from somewhere high in the elevator, came a dull thump. Clara looked up. Another thump followed. The grain in bin 7 was settling unevenly. If she left it until morning, the heat pocket could spread. If the heat spread, the lot could sour. If the lot soured, the blend would fail. If the blend failed, the train would pass Harlan Creek without stopping. Her knee throbbed. Her hands were blistered. Her chest felt hollow. She crossed the room, tore open the parts cabinet, and found the old spare motor her father had labeled in black marker 12 years earlier. It was too heavy for her to lift cleanly. She dragged it across the floor, down the step, and through the dust, inch by inch. By midnight, she had the burned fan housing open. By 2, she was crying, not because she had quit, but because she had not. By 3:30, the old spare motor caught, coughed, sparked once, and began to turn. Air moved through the bin again. Clara sat on the concrete with her back against the wall, grease across her cheek, one knee swelling under her jeans, and listened to the fan run like a stubborn heart. At sunrise, Earl Maddox drove past and saw the west fan spinning. He slowed down. Clara did not look up. The storm that followed was not large enough to make national news, but it was large enough to change Harlan Creek. Rain came hard and sideways for 2 days, turning field entrances to black gumbo and county roads into rutted trenches. Farmers who still had grain in wagons covered them with tarps and prayed the seams would hold. Trucks, trying to reach the distant terminal, bogged down on soft shoulders. The big buyer dropped its price again, blaming moisture, transportation delays, and risk. The final harvest train was still scheduled, but the railroad sent word that it would not wait. The cars would stop only if the Whitcomb siding had enough grain ready, tested, and loaded on time. Otherwise, the train would pass through Harlan Creek, take the last contracted loads farther east, and the spur would go quiet forever. Inside the elevator, humidity climbed. The grain that had been drying so carefully now threatened to pull moisture back from the air. One bin warmed 3 degrees overnight. Another tested unevenly near the bottom. Clara moved through the elevator hour after hour, checking, adjusting, transferring, blending. Her father's ledger lay open in the office, weighted by a wrench so the pages would not flutter when the door opened. The old notes became instructions. When the north wind came after rain, open high vents first. Keep damp lots separate until temperature falls. Blend only after cooling. Trust the night air after a summer front. Never chase speed at the cost of heat. On the 3rd night, the storm broke. The wind shifted north just before midnight, dry and cool, sliding across the prairie with the clean smell that comes after hard rain. Clara felt it on her face when she stepped outside. For the first time in days, she smiled without meaning to. Then she ran. She opened the vents her father had marked in the ledger 20 years before. She started the fans in sequence to keep from overloading the breaker. She moved the driest wheat across the top of a borderline lot, then pulled grain from the bottom to even the mix. She tested every bin again at 2 in the morning, then at 4. The readings fell slowly, stubbornly, but they fell. By dawn, pickups lined the road. Farmers stood beside the ditch with their caps pulled low. The banker arrived in a rain-spotted truck. The county agent parked near the scale house and did not come inside. No one laughed. The elevator was too loud for laughter anyway. Fans roared, augers rattled, grain moved through spouts and legs and worn steel like blood returning to an old heart. The train came in a pale morning fog. Its horn sounded once beyond the cottonwoods, long and low, and the whole town seemed to hold still. Clara stood by the scale house in the same shirt she had worn through the night, streaked with dust from shoulder to cuff. Her eyes were red. Her hands were raw. On the clipboard, the final moisture numbers were written in columns as neat as fence posts. The railroad inspector did not hurry. That was the worst part. He stepped down from the pickup in a clean gray shirt with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a sampling probe balanced in the other hand. To him, The Whitcomb siding was a stop on a schedule. The grain would pass, or it would not. The train would wait, or it would move on. Clara met him beside the first bin. The fog hung low around the rail cars, softening the black steel wheels and turning the waiting train into a shadow with a horn. Farmers stood along the ditch in a broken line, hands in pockets, caps pulled low. No one spoke loudly. The inspector pushed the probe deep into the first lot. Metal slid through grain with a dry, whispering sound. Clara watched his hands. He pulled the sample, poured it into a pan, and carried it to the portable tester on the tailgate. Wheat rattled against metal. He leveled it with 2 fingers, closed the lid, and pressed the button. The numbers blinked. Then the moisture reading settled. Within grade. The inspector wrote it down. No one cheered. They had 6 more lots to test. The second sample came from a bin Clara had worried over for days. It was the one she had blended after the north wind, the one that had held just enough moisture to threaten everything if her father's notes were wrong. The sample looked good in the pan. That did not mean enough. Grain could look honest and fail under a meter. The tester clicked. The screen blinked. 1 number appeared, then shifted up by 1/10. Clara stopped breathing. It shifted again. Behind her, someone in the ditch muttered a prayer without meaning to. The inspector tapped the side of the tester, waited for the final reading, and wrote it down. Still within grade. The third lot passed faster. The fourth took longer, because the inspector did a second reading. Clara's stomach turned cold when he frowned at the tester, removed the sample, cleaned the cup, and ran it again. The railroad crewman near the engine looked at his watch. Somewhere behind Clara, the banker cleared his throat and then seemed to regret making any sound at all. The second reading came back cleaner than the first. The inspector marked the sheet. The 5th lot was corn, heavier and more uneven. Clara had kept it separate until the last possible night, then blended it with the driest grain from the south bin. Her father's ledger said the south bin always cured cleaner after a north wind. Her own numbers agreed, but numbers on paper felt fragile beneath the eyes of a man who could reject the whole shipment with a pen stroke. The corn rattled into the tester. Clara's thumb pressed so hard into the edge of her clipboard that the cardboard bent. The screen blinked once. Too high. Her mouth went dry. The inspector did not speak. He lifted the tester, looked at the sample cup, and poured the corn back into the pan. A few kernels had caught near the rim, cracked and lighter than the rest. He cleaned them out with the corner of a rag and took a second sample from deeper in the pan. The watching crowd seemed to lean forward as one body. The tester ran again. This time the number came down, then down another 1/10. Then stopped, within grade by the width of a breath. The inspector wrote slowly. Clara looked away before anyone could see what almost broke across her face. The last 2 samples passed. Only then did the inspector straighten, clip the paper to his board, and nod toward the loadout. For half a second, nothing happened. Harlan Creek had spent so long expecting failure that success arrived like a language no one remembered how to speak. Then Clara raised her hand. The auger started. The old elevator answered with a deep metallic shudder. Grain surged through the spout and hammered into the first rail car, a golden river falling hard enough to echo down Main Street. The waiting farmers watched the car fill. Earl Maddox removed his cap. The county agent lowered his notebook without writing a word. The banker stared at the clipboard in Clara's hand as if the paper itself had changed the law of debt. The elevator everyone had called empty, finished, useless, and dead, filled one car, then another, then another. The final harvest train waited on the Whitcomb siding while the town watched Martin Whitcomb's daughter do what the county had believed only her father could have done. The sale price came in higher than anyone expected, not because Clara had discovered magic, and not because luck had been kind. She had created what small farmers no longer had by themselves: volume, timing, grade, and leverage. The grain that had been discounted as a problem left Harlan Creek as a clean shipment. Within a week, Clara paid the overdue banknote. She did not clear every debt in her life, but she cleared the one that mattered most. The foreclosure file closed, the farmhouse stayed hers, the elevator stayed standing. The farmers who had sold to her received bonus checks from the surplus, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket, but large enough to change the way they looked at her. The diner grew quiet when Clara came in for coffee. Not unfriendly quiet. Different quiet. The kind that arrives when people have run out of old opinions and have not yet found the courage to build new ones. The feed store owner began saving parts for her instead of asking whether she was sure she needed them. The county agent returned with a notebook of his own and asked to see how she had tracked the bin temperatures. The banker started using the word operation instead of property. Earl Maddox came last. He arrived one evening after the rail cars were gone and the tracks had gone back to silence. Clara was sweeping spilled grain from the scale house steps when his red pickup rolled in. He got out slowly, carrying his cap in one hand. For a while, he only looked at the elevator. Then he looked at Clara. He told her he had a wet bottom field every other year, the one near the creek fog, and asked whether her father's ledger had any notes on it. Clara leaned the broom against the wall. She did not smile in triumph. She did not remind him what he had said. She did not make him pay for the doubt he had carried like a right. She opened the office door and let him in. The railroad did not reverse its decision. The spur still went quiet after the final run. Grass began growing between the ties before fall. No train came the next harvest, or the one after that. The sound that had carried through Clara's childhood disappeared from Harlan Creek, leaving behind a silence wide enough to make the town feel older. So Clara changed the elevator without letting it forget what it had been. She converted the scale house into an office for a small grain cooperative. She kept the old bins for local storage and added portable aeration where she could afford it. She organized truck routes so small farmers could haul together instead of alone. She used moisture charts, harvest windows, and shared storage to help them avoid selling at the worst possible hour. Some years were still hard, some loads still failed, some prices still broke hearts. But the farmers around Harlan Creek no longer stood alone at the mercy of the first buyer who called their grain a problem. On the front of the elevator, Clara repainted her father's sign by hand. She kept the original name because she could not imagine improving it. Under Whitcomb Grain and Feed, in smaller blue letters, she added a new line. Small farms still matter. Years later, people would tell the story differently depending on who was telling it. Some would say Clara saved the elevator. Others would say she saved the last harvest run. A few would say she had simply gotten lucky with the weather, though they said it less confidently as time passed, and her cooperative kept operating season after season. Clara knew the truth was quieter. She had inherited an empty building, a stack of debts, and a town full of doubt. She had inherited her father's pencil marks, his weather notes, his stubborn belief that grain was never just grain when a family's name was tied to the land that grew it. She had listened to the old elevator when everyone else only saw rust. She had trusted records written by tired hands. She had worked through dust, rain, heat, fear, and humiliation until the truth became too heavy for anyone to laugh at. On autumn evenings, when the sun dropped behind the bins and turned the metal siding the color of old wheat, Clara still climbed the ladder to check the roof vents. From up there, she could see the farmhouse, the barn, the fields, the road into town, and the railroad tracks fading into grass. The trains were gone. The legacy was not. Below her, the elevator stood full again, not with the roar of the past, but with the steady promise of farmers who had learned to stand together. Clara would rest one hand on the railing, feel the wind shift across the prairie, and then climb down to write the day's numbers in a new ledger of her own.